All right, friends, welcome to the last session of Generation Analog 2026. Are we thinking about 2027 yet? No, let's save that. Wait. This is session 2D, and it is titled Green Actual Play. And we will open with Tarae McQueen.
Okay, let me get this set up. Hey, well, hello everyone. I'm Tarae, pronouns they, any, or as I like to say, whatever fits the bit. Um, and this is what the blue means for the green, ecological impact and radiation as magic in Dimension 20's Burrow's End. So, giving a very brief summary of the campaign itself. It is one of the side quests for Dimension 20, which is essentially anything that doesn't include the Intrepid heroes or the main six players of the original, like, Fantasy High game. Typically, most campaigns are GM'd by Brennan Lee Mulligan. The statistics for that were in my master's thesis were insane. But every once in a while, they will bring in a guest GM. And for that, this campaign was helmed by none other than your favorite GM's favorite GM, Abria Iyengar, with Brennan as a player, alongside his wife, Isabella Rowland, Erica Ishii, Jasper William Cartwright, Rashawn Nadine Scott, and Siobhan Thompson. So the players for this game were a little bit different than a lot of other TTRPGs, in that this story at its root revolves around the nuclear meltdown of a power plant known as the War and Peace Memorial Power Plant. And from the point of the meltdown to the time of the campaign taking place, 20 years, the consequences that are faced by the environment around the power plant, which brings us back to the characters in the game. So we have Ava, played by Ishii, her oldest daughter, Tula, played by Mulligan, Tula's children, Jason and Lila, played by Thompson and Rowland, respectively, Tula's younger sister, Viola, played by Scott, and her husband, Thorn, played by Cartwright. And as you can see, these are stoats, or weasels, or ermines, but for the purposes of the game, they call themselves stoats. These stoats live in what they refer to as the Red Warren, which is a former rabbit warren within the Blue Forest, which is the forest surrounding the War and Peace Memorial Power Plant, which they don't necessarily know about yet. Um, and a lot of what happens between the Red Warren and the players and characters getting to the War and Peace Memorial Power Plant at this point in the story, known as the Last Bastion of the Light, or Last Bast, is what brings us to some of the major influences for the game, which the primary one being Watership Down, which Iyengar cites as the primary influence of the story and several of the plot beats. Another prevalent one being The Rats of Nim, which is used by Iyengar for several other story elements and is Mulligan's inspiration specifically for his character Tula. The last and most important one to this particular presentation is the War and Peace Memorial Power Plant's meltdown being inspired by the Chernobyl accident, which not only allows for the assumptions that I'm going to be making about what the magic system in this game is from, but also the timing of the game being set in the 1980s. So for the framing of what I'm looking at with the game, I looked at Farah Mendelssohn's Rhetorics of Fantasy, just to examine how multi-layered the story here is. So TTRPGs, for most people, function as a level of immersive fantasy, meaning that we as players and as viewers when watching actual play kind of have to dispense with typical norms in terms of engaging ourselves in the story. For Burrow's End, this happens on multiple levels, with the players, the viewers, having to separate themselves from humanity entirely to pretend that stoats are the societal norm, which then acknowledges that humans, as characters, become an intrusion into the fantasy of the stoat world. So it functions on a very multi-layered level of fantasy, which sets the framing for how the magic system functions. So the magic system in the game is called the blue. So I had to make a few assertions as to what the blue actually is, because it's really not stated until much later in the game, and even then it's not given anything very specific. But there are clues that I use to make a lot of pretty big assumptions that I think fall under the radar of being mostly correct. So the clues that we get are that it is a visible kind of radiation, it is the color of the radiation being blue, and the fact that it is water-based. Those three things, after doing quite a bit of research, led me to Cherenkov radiation. It was discovered in 1934. It is an electromagnetic radiation that is composed primarily of beta and gamma rays, and it moves faster than light, but only in certain mediums. Those mediums are particularly dielectric liquids, which are essentially things where the electrons are not free forming. Now, it's been used in small animal imaging before, but it was only in 2020 when they started catching glimpses of it in the human body during radiation treatments for the head and neck. And part of this is a big jump to make, and I know that. But part of why I think that Cherenkov radiation is kind of the basis of the blue is from a particular image. And so this here is the Advanced Test Reactor in the Idaho National Laboratory. And this is the reactor Charlie map from episode 6 and 7 of Burrow's End. And I think there are enough similarities from something from what would have been 1960s to now for it to make sense that the radiation that we're dealing with here is particularly Cherenkov. So now the question is, where does the fallout come from and what is giving the stoats these abilities? And that is cesium-137. So this is a particular type of nuclear fallout that is found around nuclear accidents, particularly with the Chernobyl incident. And we're going to make an assumption that this is what is causing the blue. So again, no specific type of radiation is ever mentioned within the story because these are stoats. They don't know what radiation is. But in order to make this assumption, I looked at the half-life of cesium-137 or CS-137, which is approximately 30 years, which fits roughly into the timeline that we're looking at. Its effects on humans, meaning that it causes acute radiation sickness, burns, cancer, and often death with long-term exposure, and the physical state in which it exists, a liquid form at room temperature, and it turns into a powder when it comes in contact with chlorides, which can be found in soil around the power plant. Now, the real world effects within of CS-137 are that it is particularly found in game animals and lives mostly in the muscle tissue. This is kind of referenced in the game, and we'll see a little bit of the map that happens in later on. But there isn't a lot of data, as the study I found only looks at two species of deer and a species of wild boar found in Poland who are suffering from the aftermath of the CS-137 exposure from the Chernobyl accident. But there is little to no actual data on other animals, which makes sense considering that the half-life for a lot of the things that make the radiated area around Chernobyl the most dangerous are still there and will be there long after pretty much everyone here is dead. So the in-game effect is that it gives the stoats magical abilities and human intelligence, but it causes extreme mutations in other animals, like Meat Wolf. And we're going to get into that a little bit more right now. So the blues function in the game for animals in particular. Like I said, it gives the stoats extreme human level intelligence. It gives them human speech, and they are seemingly immune to the more adverse mutation effects of the blue. Mostly probably due to the fact that they don't have direct contact, but even the ones that do have direct contact with it, mainly the first stoats, who are the founders of the last bastion, didn't necessarily change. It just gave them the ability to engage with humans. But the way that those things manifest are very different for each stoat. Regardless of what happens, all stoats gain human intelligence and different physical effects, mostly the ability to walk on their hind legs exclusively. But some stoats are gifted the ability to directly manipulate the blue, which is what happens when you're a caster class as a stoat in this particular game. Other animals are mutated by their contact with it in ways that are extremely disgusting and gross, as we kind of saw with Meat Wolf, but they don't gain any human intelligence. They just, in most cases, become more violent. Like these chipmunks that developed these really gross prehensile tentacles that come out of their mouths and can grab you, that lived inside a giant, nasty zombie bear. and were feeding off of its body in order to make their burrow. And as the players refer to it, was nasty. For humans, it just kills them, which makes sense considering that direct contact with CS-137 in its powdered form can be easily inhaled and it can kill you very, very quickly. But a lot of this led me to thinking about, because we know so much about the animals within the game, there's not as much like discussion given to the physical environment, seeing as the Stoats either spend most of their time in the Red Warren or in Last Bastion. Which led me to ask a very Loraxy question, and that is, what about the trees? Because these animals have to eat something. But we don't know a lot about the Blue Forest. What we know about it is that it is dangerous due to the other animals in it, but really not much else about how CS-137 has affected the area. But looking at studies about CS-137's effects on physical environments, it hasn't had much of an effect so far, at least due to what people have been able to see with long-term CS-137 exposure to a physical environment. The heaviest effect that it's had is that it slows tree growth, but there's not necessarily anything physically that has happened to the trees or plants around it that is really any level of like researchable or noticeable. The biggest issue is that it accumulates in the soil. Like I said, CS-137 in its powdered form bonds with chlorides and creates a very toxic powder. And this bioaccumulates in the soil, which creates a constant cycle of radiation, where you have the CS-137 in the soil, it goes into the plants are consumed by the animals, it moves to the animals, game animals absorb it into their muscle tissue, then it goes back into the soil, repeat, no rinsing. It just happens over and over and over again. So assuming that this is what is happening in this situation, the research on CS-137 is very slow coming. So a lot of this is me making big leaps and making a lot of assumptions in terms to what actually is happening in this game, but there's not a lot of available research, and because the game is not necessarily specific about what is causing the blue, the type of radiation, these are the best assumptions that I could come up with that made the campaign and the story make sense according to the science that we had available. Okay. And this is my bibliography and all the places you can find me.
Awesome. Really interesting. I just put in chat that cesium salt burns purple blue. So more evidence for you. There. All right. Up next is Anna Judelson, and on green as other.
Hiya, can you see my screen?
Yes. Perfect.
All right. Hi, I'm Anna. I am currently a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh studying intermediality. And my research kind of mirrors the previous presentations from the previous panels. I also discuss green as other, but this time not from the perspective of queerness, as one of the previous panelists, but from the perspective of racial alienation. Without conflating green to any real race, mainly just discussing it as an allegory. Just a few words about my positionality before I start. I don't belong to any racialized communities, and therefore I don't claim any expertise on the experiences. But my research is intersectional, and even though mostly I study masculinity and the performance of masculinity within actual play spaces, the intersectional approach also leads me to researching the racialized aspects. Talking about actual play, why it's important to study to begin with, and why what makes it such an interesting phenomenon. First of all, it's collaborative. It's probably one of the most, well, telling examples of collaborative storytelling because it's not scripted, unlike what a lot of people accuse Critical Role of. It emerges through players' decisions, improvisation, and the outcome of dice rolls. So there is this luck effect there as well. Because actual play combines collaborative storytelling, gaming, digital media, it offers a particularly interesting space for examining representation. Now, before we begin, it's useful to establish what I mean by collaboration. It's already also been touched upon. I particularly talk about collaboration not between characters, but between the players. In my view, collaboration is not the same as interactivity. It's shared agency to influence the story. So people are able to act within the story and see meaningful consequences of their actions. So this collaborative structure has long been associated with dialogue, learning, empowerment, and combined with digital media, which lowers barriers for participation compared to, for example, mass media, and values personal storytelling or the appearance of it, actual play has potential to amplify voices that have historically been marginalized. The key word here is potential. My argument today is that actual play can renegotiate dominant narratives about race and otherness through collaborative storytelling. At the same time, it inherits many of fantasy's older conventions and biases. And to explore this tension, I focus on the reoccurring metaphor of green skin. I'm going to do it through the case study of Mighty Nine, which is the second campaign of Critical Role, and particularly through the character of Ford Stone. Ford, played by Travis Willingham, is half human, half orc sailor. In D&D terms, he's a warlock, which means that he's in a pact with an otherworldly entity that grants him magical powers in exchange for servitude. Ford experiences severe bullying throughout his childhood because of his appearance. And at the start of the campaign, he is struggling to define himself without the influence of the people and powers that shaped him. Because of that, he radically reinvents himself to gain social power and acceptance. And to understand Ford, we first need to understand a little background behind green skin. As it's been mentioned today already, I'm not going to delve too deep into this, but green has long been associated with otherness in Western storytelling. From more contemporary examples, characters like Shrek, the Grinch, Elphaba from Wicked, all use green skin as a visual marker of exclusion. And in addition to that, green skin has often functioned as a displacement mechanism. As explicitly racialized portrayals became less socially acceptable over time, fantasy increasingly used impossible skin colors and non-human bodies to carry similar symbolic meaning. Green skin allows stories to discuss exclusion while maintaining distance from real-world racism. And Brady Hammond argues, therefore, that he introduces the idea of green face as a result, which is when white actors or people who otherwise have not experienced racial marginalization portray experiences that are racially coded through fantasy rather than explicit race. This becomes especially relevant within our case study, and particularly when we turn to fantasy races such as orcs. So, yes, fantasy inherited many conventions from colonial literature that routinely divided the world into civilized, usually white heroes, and primitive, hostile other. Helen Young describes this as fantasy's habits of whiteness, patterns that position whiteness as the default while marking others through difference, such as difference in skin color, whether it's a real skin color or a fantasy skin color. Orcs are one of the clearest examples because while we are not equating them with any real-world ethnic group, they have consistently been portrayed as non-Western, culturally inferior in some way, and also often inherently violent. It did not help that the original portrayals incorporated real racialized features, such as dark complexion. Orcs' green skin came in much, much later. These ideas originate with Tolkien and later reinforced by D&D. For example, in the 2014 Player's Handbook, the version that was in use when the Mighty Nine aired, suggested that half-orcs possessed an innate tendency towards violence and framed their human ancestry as something that moderated their orcish nature. This closely matches the rhetoric of miscegenation that attributes moral corruption to mixing of backgrounds. Although recent editions have moved away from this language, Ford was created within that earlier framework. And this brings us to the central question of this case study. How does Mighty Nine engage with these inherent assumptions? And to answer this question, we are going to address Homi Bhabha's hybridity theory, particularly the concepts such as ambivalence, unhomely people, and the instability of identity. So basically, Bhabha argues that colonial conditions produce ambivalence, which is unstable in-between identities shaped by lack of belonging. Although hybridity has power to destabilize colonial narratives and be empowering, in fiction, that ambivalence is often framed as tragedy. For example, it's often the case in media that biracial characters are often expected to choose between being authentic or being accepted. And Ford's story initially follows a similar pattern. Throughout the campaign, he repeatedly tries to reinvent himself. He changes his accent, he imitates the speech and mannerisms of his mentor. Most significantly, he files down his tasks in an attempt to appear more human. First major example appears in episode 16. During the conversation with the party, Ford reveals that his tasks are damaged. And on this slide, you can see the fragment of a comic book about Ford's backstory, which goes into much more emotional detail of that period of his life than the show does. The show very much downplays this aspect. So this is very much how the reveal happened. So Ford reveals that his tasks are damaged, and when asked about them, he explains that children mocked his teeth when he was younger. So he began filing them down to remove what he saw as an obvious target, obviously causing himself a lot of pain in the process. What makes the scene particularly interesting is that the revelation emerges collaboratively. Ford initially avoids the topic, but the other players continue asking questions, continue probing him to open up until he finally does. The conversation also reveals a contradiction at the center of his identity. Ford admits that part of him wishes he still had larger tasks because they represent the tough front that he puts forward. At the same time, he feels safer and more accepted without them. This mirrors a common real-world dynamic in which racialized people sometimes feel pressure to alter aspects of their appearance to fit the dominant expectations. So the tasks become a fantasy equivalent of those pressures. However, the scene also reveals one limitation of the campaign's treatment of race. Once the issue is identified, the other characters simply reassure Ford that his tasks are acceptable, and the deeper structures that made him feel compelled to change himself are largely unexplored and ignored further on. The discussion of discrimination mostly exists as the thing of the past. The second scene that complicates the matter further happens in episode 58. Ford speaks with another half-orc named Wursh. Wursh notices Ford's insecurities and tells him not to be ashamed of his ancestry. On the surface, this appears to be a positive conversation and a positive messaging. However, the dialogue introduces a tension between the player's interpretation of the character and the inherent assumptions of the D&D lore. The aforementioned D&D lore. When Wursh speaks about the blood we came from, as on the slide, he frames orcish ancestry as something associated with anger that must be managed, although nothing to be ashamed of. This reflects the older player's handbook language about half-orcs carrying the dangerous nature within them. The player, Travis, seems to push back against this interpretation by asking, "What blood are you talking about?" For Ford, the source of his struggles is not his orcish ancestry, but the discrimination he has experienced by humans. Yet, because actual play is collaborative and improvised, The conversation never fully resolves this tension. Instead, it exposes the different assumption operating within the performance. This is one of the most interesting aspects of actual play as a medium, because meaning is created not by a single author, but by people altogether. And while sometimes it can create interesting and diverse perspectives, other times, because of the collaborative nature, some things might get lost in misunderstanding, or the improvisation otherwise might not allow a deeper dive into a topic. So, final scene occurs in the episode 72, and it's a very short and quiet resolution of the arc of self-acceptance. At this point, Ford has decided to reject the influence of his patron, who has been controlling him, and he's finally choosing his own path rather than trying to live according to someone else's expectations. Just before this climactic moment in his arc, Laura Bailey's character casually remarks in the middle of a completely unrelated conversation, "Your tasks look pretty good coming in, by the way." It is a very small line, but it carries a significant meaning, because the tasks once represented shame, exclusion, and self-modification now are a sign of self-acceptance. Importantly, compared to the tropes established in media, Ford does not achieve this acceptance through assimilation, nor does he have to sacrifice community in order to embrace his identity. Instead, he gains both authenticity and belonging. In that sense, the Mighty Nine ultimately reworks the dramatic colonial narrative. However, it does not fully engage with the systemic causes of the issue. Now, as the animated adaptation of the campaign is airing, this is getting addressed as more explicitly, as racism is not written off as the thing of the past. To conclude, actual play is not automatically a solution to problems of representation. Like any genre, it reproduces some harmful assumptions while challenging others. The case of Ford demonstrates both possibilities. Collaborative storytelling allows players to explore difficult topics from multiple perspectives and sometimes produce interpretations that challenge established fantasy conventions. At the same time, improvisation can reproduce problematic ideas, or leave important questions unresolved. Green skin is particularly useful for understanding this tension. As a metaphor, it can encourage audience to reflect on exclusion, prejudice, and belonging. However, it can also obscure the real-world histories that inspire those narratives in the first place. Ultimately, it has significant potential as a space where dominant narratives can be questioned and reimagined, but that potential is not guaranteed. It depends on how creators engage with the conventions they inherit and how critically audience interpret the stories they tell. At the end, I would like to hear your thoughts and suggestions. What practices do you think actual play could adapt to live up to its full potential as a place of empowerment? And I would be happy to hear any feedback. Please reach out to me separately. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. Up next, I assume Tom, that's just Tom in the chat, is the Tom.
I believe so.
Single Tom. Okay. So I will make sure they're promoted. There we go. So up next we have Keerthi and Tom performing the dungeon.
Alrighty. Gonna share a video here. Bear with me. To talk about sex. Making it. 1 second. All right, here we go. Hey gang, thanks for having us. Tom and I are here today to talk about sex, making this my second year running of being a prude at Generation Analog. We're specifically going to be discussing actual play in relation to sex work by examining a few key confluences of the two through the lenses of parasexuality, labor, and platform ethics. We do this to argue that the presence of sex workers in actual play media is not just an awkward footnote, but rather indicative of the fact that skills essential to the sex industry, and the online sex industry in particular, were skills that successful actual play live streaming required. For us, this correspondence highlights how live streaming structures performer-audience relations and the kinds of labor that demands. As a heads up, some of the cases we're looking at today involve some pretty shitty people. We're foregrounding the historical argument we're making over the shittiness in question, with the very emphatic caveat that said argument is also about social capital in relation to both actual play and sex work, and what the construction of these performance spaces historically enables in terms of abuses of power. All of which to say, just because our talk is not focused on the problematic acts of certain individuals, doesn't mean we're unaware of them or advocating for them to be swept under the rug. To that end, we've included a list of resources and further reading at the end of this presentation for anyone who'd like to inform themselves further on things we spend a little less time on today.
Let's talk parasexuality. Bailey's account of the Victorian-era barmaid, where he coins this term, describes it as a sexuality that is deployed but contained, carefully channeled rather than fully discharged. Sexuality here is not suppressed or hidden, but is carefully controlled and transformed into a commodity. It operates in the middle ground between public and private. In the everyday settings of the Victorian pub, where managers constructed a form of open yet illicit sexuality. In Bailey's formulation, it acts as an inoculation in which a little sexuality is encouraged as an antidote to its subversive properties. Parasexuality describes the conditions of sexualized labor that is organized, contained, and monetized through a specific institutional structure. Bailey also gestures to the broader relevance of the concept, noting that the barmaid's role was shared not only with the actress, but with other young women workers from an expanding new service sector. Distance was the constitutive mechanism of parasexuality in the Victorian pub. The counter, the literal bar, provided a material and symbolic structure that kept the barmaid almost literally out of reach, while simultaneously making her more visible, more staged, more available to the consumer's gaze. For Bailey, distance operates across temporal, spatial, architectural, and representational registers, arguing that it heightens desire through the tension generated by the separation of the glamour object and the beholder, a separation that also functions to limit the expression or consummation of desire. Glamour is the visual code through which this managed distance is experienced, a dramatically enhanced yet distant style of sexual representation, display, or address that transforms the worker into a spectacle without permitting contact. Parasexuality manages the threshold between prudery and scandal, avoiding both the excesses of sexuality that would reclassify glamour as pornography or prostitution, and the suppression that would put off the customer consumer. The live stream interface is a new instantiation of that threshold, a different technology maintaining the same structural relation between the visibility and containment of women's sexuality.
When we talk about live streaming, we draw on Teresa Sempt's discussion of the affective labors and theatrical authenticity of home camming. Sempt looks at iconic cam girls such as Jennifer Ringley and Anna Voog in the 1990s, whose home camera setups would transmit silent still images every few minutes of these women living their authentic lives, also including live quote-unquote footage of sex acts. The appeal of this kind of proto-live stream content, per Sempt, lay in the idea that viewers were seeing something real and unfiltered. They experienced a kind of perceived closeness enabled by the digital window into one's home life. Relevant point of order here, all of these camera setups were in domestic spaces, almost always featuring at least one camera in the bedroom. This was supplemented by cam girls' interactions with their audiences, with some chatting to viewers as regularly as every day. Sempt's theory of microcelebrity holds many similarities to current-day discussions of parasociality, which we'll get to in a minute. Cam girls were situated in an in-between space where they were not television or film stars, but were also markedly different from ordinary people. The boom in home camming production and consumption led to the formation of fandom-like communities that performers described as family, and to whom performers often felt obligated in terms of not only interacting regularly, but also sticking to their perceived brand and shtick. Cam girls who wanted to maintain popularity were required to maintain intimacy at a distance, encouraging viewers to look closer, investigate, and dig through not only footage archives, but diary entries, blog posts, personality ephemera to get more of the real, but also negotiating distance, not permitting contact or consummation of the projected sexuality. This delicate balance of simulated authenticity is, for us, comparable to Bailey's barmaid and her balancing act.
I Hit It With My Axe launched in 2010 on The Escapist. It was built around the premise of a home D&D campaign whose cast were adult performers. I Hit It With My Axe was part of a broader shift over 2008 to 2012 where D&D media shifted to the recordings of actual plays. It was also one of the first shows to cause a stir just by being a group that was mostly made up of women. From the start of mainstream tabletop role-playing game streaming, the issue of sex workers and women being visible in the hobby has been entangled.
My younger brother is like a DM, and I always wanted to play. This was a long time ago. This was probably 15 years ago. And I always wanted to play, and I'd be like, let me play. And he'd be like, ow, what a jerk. Yeah, because it was like a boys club or something. And I was like, let me play. And he'd be, no. So then my mom finally said, let your sister play. He'd like led me into a town, or they led me in. He didn't want me to play.
In 2019, the original DM of I Hit It With My Axe, Zach Smith, was accused of sustained sexual, physical, and psychological abuse by his former partner. Wizards of the Coast pulled his 5th edition credit. Gen Con banned him. His publisher cut ties. The speed and uniformity of the response is important. These same institutions have been perfectly happy to take the street credibility and attention the architect of I Hit It With My Axe brought them through its carefully managed parasexual inclusion of sex workers that Smith represented. Phoenix was a cast member of I Hit It With My Axe. By 2017, she was a prominent DM in the actual play scene. When a Diana Jones Award was given to actual play as a movement in 2018, Phoenix was one of the 4 people who accepted the award. In 2022, more than a dozen former collaborators came forward publicly accusing Phoenix and her partner of bullying and mistreatment. Phoenix accepting the Diana Jones Award on behalf of the entire actual play movement is the constrained sexuality of parasexuality being celebrated by the industry as a whole. Through her, the industry acknowledged the role of glamour in live streaming, which cultivated and sustained the audiences of emergent D&D media as long as it was contained. Roll for Seduction is a collective of sex workers making tabletop content. Where I Hit It With My Axe introduced sex workers at an ordinary table, and Phoenix converted their origin into mainstream legitimacy, Roll for Seduction and tabletopless live streaming groups indicate a normalization and sidelining of the intersections of sex work and live streaming, which relies on digital platforms working across mainstream live streaming platforms like Twitch, alongside sex worker-friendly camming sites like Plexstorm and Joystick TV, and creator monetization platforms like Fansly and OnlyFans. Functionally, the genre that Roll for Seduction represents is kept at a distance from mainstream live streaming through the platforms they use to distribute their erotic content. When this genre ventures into more everyday live streaming platforms, their point of difference is constrained by the strict, although often subverted, rules regarding how bodies are presented. When it is unconstrained, it is relegated to the periphery and treated as a genre of sex work rather than an intersection with tabletop.
Okay, that was a lot. So to restate our argument, we hold that actual play formats provided an early and unusually legible bridge between tabletop role-playing cultures and forms of erotic, affective, and gendered labor that had already migrated online. Thinking again about distance as a constitutive mechanism in these simultaneous sex work and tabletop spaces, we see a recurring trend of official tabletop industry spaces to accept the hype and reach afforded them by sex work that engages with tabletop roleplay and nerddom writ large, while still maintaining a careful separation that ensures the palatability and supposed all-ages appeal of the gaming product itself. The front line of actual play, which is what we're calling shows like Dimension 20 and Critical Role, are caught up in this moment of branding, where these affective and gendered forms of labor are part and parcel of what it means in the current moment to be an actual play celebrity. Being a specific actual play performer is no longer a role confined to the edges of a table or set, but rather one that can be interviewed, profiled, and again, dug through to find more realness. This is, of course, situated within a wider media context of traditional press junkets increasingly being overshadowed by interview formats that resemble domestic or quasi-third space settings, cooking or eating a meal, going on a date. We are obviously at a very particular juncture in the celebrity space. This context informs the ways in which sexuality, and queer sexuality in particular, are brought forward in these celebrity spaces by actual play performers. I want to show y'all a clip from just this past week of the cast of Critical Role on a cooking show to promote a new season of their TV show.
Are you all lovers? Are you guys all in a polyamorous situation?
Like a big polycule?
Yeah, we're a big polycule.
You guys are the first polycule I've ever met.
Did you answer yes? You answered yes? Okay.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, no, really?
Our point here is that the particular juncture of celebrity we mentioned is specifically informed by its proximity to sexuality as a carefully negotiated resource, both within actual play and beyond, and that this warrants taking a closer look at some historically relevant examples of sexuality being deployed as an inoculating commercial resource within gaming, such as in the images that we've shared throughout this presentation. We hope to have highlighted, in the cases we've brought here, how sexuality that was previously permitted, encouraged, monetizable in gaming and nerd spaces, actual play spaces in particular, becomes disallowed and distanced from the industry image when it is deliberately enacted by sex workers and not simply occupying a peripheral sense of sexiness. It's been long established, too, that actual play has a safety problem. We want to say that we hope the confluences highlighted in this talk debunk the still persistent rhetoric that tabletop designers, players, and performers alike need only look to sex and kink communities to find the answer to safety. This is a broken record moment for me, but safety, rather than being a tool or set of tools, is better understood as a continuous practice of communication and transparency, and as such, it can't be assumed to be present or automatically integrated into tabletop spaces, public or private, family-friendly or adult. Thank you so much for having us once again. As mentioned up top, we've collated a little list of resources for anyone who'd like to do some further reading about some of the things we've talked about here today. You can find that on either of our Blue Sky profiles, said here. Comments, questions, concerns that don't get answered in the panel session, feel free to reach out. We love a cold email.
Awesome, amazing. Everyone is coming in on time or a little below, which is great. I love this. Okay, rounding out the session is Kirsten Shields on Shades of Green and Aromanticism. So totally different side of things, maybe.
Okay. So before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you to the Generation Analog team and everyone who's presented at this conference. It's been such an amazing time, and I've really enjoyed hearing about everyone's projects. If I get a bit scatterbrained, I do apologize in advance. It's a bit past 7 a.m. for me right now, and I've been here the whole time, which for me means since 11 p.m. So I am so very tired. But it has been very fun and worth it. So getting into the talk, the genesis of this talk for me was trying to name aromantic characters. And I realized just how many of my examples came from actual play as compared to more mainstream media. Now, there might be a bit of bias there because I watch a lot of actual play. But the more I thought about it, the more that stood out to me was the quality of the aromantic characters and the way that their aromanticism was integrated into their stories. Aromanticism is a romantic orientation that describes someone who experiences little to no romantic attraction, with that person being aromantic. Aromanticism is a spectrum that has many identities underneath its umbrella to describe the complex relationship that individuals can have with romantic attraction. Now, while I'm not going to go through all these identities, select few I have on screen, I really wanted to highlight the breadth of aromantic experiences and how, while it is a community, it's not a one-size-fits-all type of label. Aromanticism is often conflated with asexuality, as they both have to do with a lack of attraction. And the necessity of the distinction between the two can be confusing for those outside the community, as most other orientations don't distinguish between sexual and romantic attraction. However, multiple studies have shown that the majority of asexual respondents do not identify as aromantic, with roughly 20 to 25% identifying as aromantic and 70-odd% identifying as alloromantic, that is, someone who experiences romantic attraction. And while the majority of aromantic respondents to a 2024 study do identify as asexual, there is still an amount that are allosexual. Furthermore, 90.3% of the participants responded that aromanticism should not be encapsulated by the asexual label. Instead, many in the community use the split attraction model, SAM, that separates sexual attraction from romantic attraction. Even amongst those who are both asexual and aromantic, the majority still use the split attraction model to describe their orientation, using the term aro-ace rather than simply referring to themselves as asexual. The reason that many make this distinction is that while asexuality and aromanticism are related, there are some experiences that are unique to aromanticism that asexual alloromantic people do not experience, and asexual experiences that allosexual aromantic people do not relate to. So when it comes to finding aromantic characters, there can be a bit of confusion when a character is said to be asexual, but not explicitly said to be aromantic. Are they aromantic or not? This is the case for the first character I'll be talking about today, Riz Gukgak from Dimension 20's Fantasy High, played by Brian Murphy. Riz was confirmed to be asexual by GM Brennan Lee Mulligan on the accompanying show Adventuring Party during the first season of Fantasy High. However, due to the portrayal of the character, and in particular his character arc in Season 2, I believe this is a case of asexuality being used as a blanket term, and that Riz is also intended to be aromantic. Central to this theory is the non-player character, Baron from the Baronies. Baron was first introduced by Murphy when Riz attempted to lie to his friends about being in a relationship in order to fit in with them. Mulligan took this idea and spun up the character of Baron, who crawls out of Riz's mirror and claims to be his romance partner. Baron is not so much a person, but an embodiment of Riz's fears, brought to life by the Nightmare King. When the party later finds themselves in the forest of their Nightmare King, Mulligan asks each player to name their character's greatest fear. Murphy makes the offer that Riz's greatest fear is messing up and letting his characters down. But Mulligan doesn't leave it there. He takes that and pushes it a step further, which is part of what is so great about actual play as a medium. It's built upon a constant negotiation between the players, leading them to create a story that is more than a single person ideas or perspectives. In this case, it's Baron digging deeper into what is behind Riz's fear by showing him visions of his friends with their love interests and telling him, the years will go by and everyone will find someone that matters more to them than you. It's this moment that cements Riz as an aromantic character to me. The idea that his friends are the most important people in his life, but the knowledge that they will always have a relationship that they value more than him. This is a quintessential aromantic experience and not an asexual one. Amatonormativity is the assumption that everyone desires an exclusive romantic relationship and that their goal in life is to have one. For me, Baron is a physical manifestation of amatonormativity, of Riz's desires to fit in with everyone else. But this isn't everyone's goal. Relationship anarchy is a political philosophy gaining traction in both aromantic and polyamorous communities that rejects the hierarchical organization of relationships. It aims to address the social, legal, and financial advantages to being in a monogamous romantic relationship. So for Riz's character arc to revolve not around him accepting who he is, but to understand that he is important to his friends and they love him and they won't abandon him if he isn't useful to them, is one of aromantic acceptance. This continues with Prince and Hera from Dimension 20's A Court of Fey and Flowers. They were similarly confirmed to be asexual by their player Omar Najam, during an episode of Adventuring Party in a tweet as for sure on the aromantic spectrum. And Hera's aura of devotion ability means that they and friendly creatures within 10 feet can't be charmed. The charmed condition in D&D mechanically means that the affected creature can't attack the caster, but it's also often flavored to have the charmed creature be in love with the caster. In episode 4, another character drinks a love potion that charms her to fall in love with another character, but when Hera walks over, she snaps out of it. This combination of mechanical and character choices makes it seem like Hera's aromantic aura is just so strong that he can't be charmed to magically fall in love, and those around him can't either. By the end of the series, Hera is in a relationship with another character, Binks. This relationship develops slowly and first comes from a place of friendship. For people on the aromantic spectrum, this is often the case. When you experience little to no romantic attraction, often a bond is formed before romantic feelings develop. But even then, the relationship is mechanically an unusual one. The courts of A Court of Play and Flowers are so important because that's where the character's magic comes from. The other player-character relationship of the season between Hob and Rue has both of them leaving their courts to be together in what could be considered a more traditional queer-coded story. Rue leaves her court because they don't match her ideals surrounding love, and Hob leaves his court to be with her, both prioritizing their love for each other over their courts. However, Hera and Binks forge their own relationship, not one within a single court or outside of a court, but a third type of relationship. Hera is still the prince of his own court, but also pledges themselves as a knight to Binks, who is a leader of her own courts. This decision on Hera's part causes him to have to make a charisma saving throw, as the magic within them becomes unstable. In this way, Hera and Binks have a queer platonic relationship. Queer platonic relationships are committed, non-romantic relationships that go beyond what is considered normal for a friendship. What this entails exactly is up to the people within that relationship. But what defines it is being a relationship that does not fit into the existing categories of platonic or romantic. Just as Hera's choice to be part of two courts does not fit into an existing choice of either being in a single court or in no court. While Hera's relationship could be seen as queer platonic, two characters who are definitely in a queer platonic relationship are Zolf Smith and Oscar Wilde from Rusty Quill Gaming. Zolf is confirmed to be asexual biromantic by his player Ben Meredith during the 4th season of the show. Wilde is a non-player character and a fictional version of real historical figure Oscar Wilde. The dynamic between the characters develops naturally throughout the course of the show, and as they grow close, the other players begin to question the nature of their relationship. Because actual play shows are improvised, a lot of these story elements aren't planned in advance, but rather discovered through play. Such is the case between Zolf and Wilde, with both his player and GM Alexander Newell, leaving it open, but acknowledging that there is something meaningful between the two characters. A few episodes later, during episode 181, Meredith makes the announcement that he's decided that the characters are going to be in a platonic relationship. The reason he gives for this is that he himself is not comfortable role-playing a romantic relationship with a historical figure. And this is a really important discussion to have, and I'm so glad they included it within the runtime of the episode, when so many of these conversations happen off-screen in actual play shows. Consent is vital in any role-play environment, and romantic consent, to have your character be in a romantic relationship, is something that needs to be discussed in advance by the players, regardless of how they want to navigate that relationship in-game. So with Zolf and Wilde's relationship situated firmly as non-romantic, and yet intimate in ways that go beyond a normal friendship, it falls into the realm of queer platonic. The interactions between Zolf and Wilde, and the way their characters revolve around each other, and the reveal in the epilogue that they now run a pub together, all shows the ways in which this relationship is important to the characters. And this stands out in particular because neither of these characters are aromantic. And yet by choosing this platonic life partnership, rather than having them be in romantic relationships with other characters, is a rejection of a metanormativity. Tabletop role-playing games are widely understood to be a place where players can explore their own identities, but also engage with the experiences that are not their own. This is largely done through roleplay, especially in systems such as Dungeons & Dragons that focus mainly on combat mechanics. But recently, there's been a rise in queer tabletop games. That is, games that's premise and mechanics revolve around sexual and gender orientations, such as Monster Hearts 2, Alice is Missing, Sleepaway, and Thirsty Sword Lesbians. But there still aren't many games that meaningfully engage with aromanticism, past a glancing reference, which is usually to asexuality, which is a shame because there are so many interesting, unique stories that can come from exploring aromanticism, as I hope I've adequately shown through my 3 examples above. On that note, I was able to find an aromantic TTRPG, which was made by Mberry as part of Arrowjam 2022. And this is a two-player game about how relationships change over time and the impact of aromanticism on that relationship. So I highly recommend checking that out. Now, I could go on a lot more about this topic, and there are other characters that I don't have time to get to. But yeah, that's all I really was able to fit into this presentation. So thank you.
Awesome. What's the name of that game? Or did I miss it?
The name is A/Romantic.
Oh, okay. Okay. That was the name. I didn't know if it was just the illustration. It's both. Okay.
Yes.
Happy to have folks come back on screen if they'd like to do Q&A. We have about 22 minutes or so. So questions are starting to line up. And so I am going to just sort of look for it. Again, if someone in Discord can bubble the questions up to the present, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your ideas and conversations, particularly about the actual play form, genre, platform, multimodal, whatever we want to call it. I think there's a lot of rich stuff to sort of think about and connect. So let's start, I guess, with the question in the Q&A file. One of the participants asks, what role, back to our sort of session 0 conversation from previous, should session 0 or collaborative agreements play? What role should these things play when players wish to portray characters engaged in sex work or other socially sensitive professions? And I'm happy if anybody answers that question, actually.
Maybe I'll start us off by saying the same role as if you're portraying any character. Tom probably has a long rant about this, so I will attempt to give the TLDR version of it. But the sort of point I think that we keep trying to make in these conversations, and I say we as in like the sort of community of scholars that has gathered here, is that we need to stop looking at the convergence of sex work and other work as sort of incidental, as this like awkward thing, taboo thing that we don't speak about, and therefore needing special conditions or special sort of social arrangements in order to accommodate. That is part of the problem, right? This sort of forced isolation of a very specific kind of affective labor, but that still shares relationality and a lot of similarities to other forms of affective labor. And I think that really embracing those similarities will help us understand really how essential things like safety and calibration and collaborative tools are necessary in also non-adult, right, or like non-sexual environments, if there is such a thing. But I'll stop there for now.
Other thoughts on this idea about prepping folks? I mean, I think we've had a lot of conversation about this. Like, I think like you should talk to players, you should talk to each other, you should decide, what you want to talk about, what you want to do, what you don't want to do. I mean, that's true of I think any activity, but I think in role playing it is super important. But there are things, as Keerthi, you're sort of saying, is that we sort of mark off as special or unique or different or problematic maybe. But yet, no one asks like the person that's going to play the tank or the warrior or the assassin, like, how violent do you want to be, right? And maybe people do. I don't know. I don't know if we ever have that conversation about, how much pillaging do you and plundering do you actually want to do, right? And so, yeah. To continue, Luca in chat asks again, Keerthi and Tom. Is this the same conversation? Similar. Yeah. Do the use of safety tools, communication tools, calibration tools, should they happen on screen in actual plays, i.e. shown during the course of play, or only happen backstage?
I think I have already made some sort of soapbox stance on this in the Discord. Sorry, gang. It is 11:30 p.m. for me, but so I'm doing my best. But I think that yes, my personal stance is that these things should not happen backstage or off screen, so to speak. But I also think, crucially, their presence, like the presence of safety tools and practices on stage or on screen, does not automatically guarantee safety. So there is more work to be done than just having an X card available to performers that is visible to audience, right?
Yeah. Okay. Jason asks, Monster Hearts as a system is distinguished in part by the way characters do not entirely control their emotions, though they can control how the character reacts to them. This is notably true for the ability of one character to turn on another, but also applies to the different psychological tropes of the different playbooks. I've always found this opens up me up to go in directions I had not planned, but how does that potential affect the use of the game for planned outcomes or in environments of social risk, such as actual play? I'm not familiar with Monster Hearts, so.
Yeah, so that's part of what I was talking about when there are, in existing in Monster Hearts, it kind of references in that ruling, it says like this doesn't have to be like a turning on in a sexual way, but it is, so, but again, that's just like kind of like an oblique reference, as like kind of like a cop out for that rule almost, rather than actually engaging with asexuality and aromanticism within the actual mechanics. Like there isn't a mechanic that is specifically to do with queer platonic relationships or asexual relationships that are not aromantic, or aromantic relationships that are not asexual and stuff like that. So it's very much one of those things where the conversations are starting to be had in queer tabletop role-playing spaces, but there's definitely still a lot further that can be gone in order to just play the breadth of human experience and what the different complex relationships people can have with romance and sexuality.
Yeah, I always belong. I mean, I'm sure someone has written about this. Someone will know in chat. But when I came up in learning how to play TTRPGs, like our philosophy is that you usually don't use skills and abilities against other players, right? So the idea that those are there for you to navigate the world around you and NPCs. But so like if you have a skill that can like charm or whatever someone else, like it was seen as bad form sometimes to turn that against your own players. But I guess that's a different kind of contract depending on whether you're going to go PvP or not. In this case, different kind of player versus player. Other questions, or do presenters have questions or comments for each other? Some of us are on the tail end of our energies, so which is totally understandable. It's been a long 2 days. Good, but long. Okay, well, folks are thinking then. I guess I'm just going to sort of circle back. I'm just going to go through some of my notes back to Tarae. Could you just re-explain, or that's a whole terrible way to say that. I guess like I think these connections that you're making between real science and the actual play, or real life, environmental concerns and tabletop role playing games are really cool. What do you plan on doing with this, or how does this fit into some other project or a larger project that you're working on?
Right now, I am hoping to use it to expand my thesis research into something a little bit deeper, since my master's thesis was specifically written about TTRPGs as ways to get viewers socially and politically active. And it was a case study on Dimension 20, since I was looking at 3 of the Intrepid Hero campaigns. So the idea of expanding it into something a little bit more comprehensive is definitely in the works, but that's not necessarily something that I can do on my own, at least not at this juncture. But I was looking specifically at like general socio-political issues with my master's research. And it's just starting to build the framework, because in terms of cinema studies in particular, there wasn't really any literature aside from the actual play as actual art JCMS volume, which one of my professors sent to me as I was getting ready to write my master's thesis, because I don't have the money to subscribe to JCMS because I just graduated and I don't
Right.
have a job yet. But
Yeah.
yeah, but it was eventually the idea is to expand it into looking at specific targeted sociopolitical issues that are dealt with in various kinds of actual play. Then that also requires me to have the time to watch different actual plays instead of just Dimension 20. But Dimension 20 is an easy one to do because the campaigns are shorter, and it's the time limit that I had as writing my thesis just allowed that to be the easier thing to do, because I'd already
Right.
watched most of the things I was writing about. But eventually I would like to it would just be an expansion of the work that I have been doing in terms of looking at TTRPGs as a way to get people engaged politically.
So, I mean, that's one of the limitations of actual play, is that especially if you're watching something that is like has huge runs, right? Hours and hours and hours and hours. Even like the limited runs of campaigns or seasons of Dimension 20 as compared to, let's say, Critical Role, which is like, we're just gonna turn the camera on and go. So I guess maybe I can ask everybody here, like, what's one affordance or one advantage of actual play that you see that's really different than any of the other like top games themselves? Or, I mean, you kind of cover this in your talk, but is there anything else that sort of comes to mind that you feel like this is where we should really drill down in the study of AP? Or if you have a really short actual play that you recommend that we all should watch.
I think as yeah, like I'm looking at I have my iPad open with the Discord up, and I
Yeah.
agree with like there's not really because coming at it from a cinema studies lens, there's simply not enough research. So I was genuinely flying by the seat of my
Right.
pants in terms of everything that
Yeah.
I was doing. So I was having to apply like other cinematic theory, like political cinema, to something that admittedly isn't necessary. Like people are just now starting to consider it to be a form of cinema. So just
Yeah.
within the last few years. So that I think has been definitely a challenge. And I think, yes, I think there is definitely a pathway for it to become an incredibly like powerful and efficable point of political cinema, especially as more people are incorporating and talking about bleed, in particular, Janaya Kemper's emancipatory bleed, which I do talk about in my thesis quite a bit. But there's not really enough research about it to be able to do much with it from that lens yet. So that's part of what made my thesis so difficult, is because there was really nothing for me to go on. I was having to just kind of create my own theories from scratch.
100% agree.
Welcome to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, currently I presented the part of my research where I mostly analyze the case studies, and there you can use the previously used theories from sociology, from film studies, from pretty much like they're there. But the second part of my thesis I'm going to dedicate to the interactions with the audience and within the audience, how the audience is affected by actual play. And this is something where you don't even know where to begin, because you can delve into like Reddit threads or YouTube comments, but then there is the informed consent issue. Also, there is very little theory on how to handle audience interaction specifically within actual play, so you have to mostly go towards other digital media formats. There is quite a lot on podcasts, to be honest, which there is obviously quite a bit of an overlap. But yeah, I feel like what's currently under-researched is the parasociality within the audience.
Yeah, I mean, that research, of course, is growing. And of course, this is the double-edged sword that you now get to do it, right? And so, and you get to sort of outline the things that are the most important to you. And then people will come along and use your research. There's a question by Liam for Keerthi and Tom. What do you think the role of the performer is in the discussion of parasociality and parasexuality? Both topics feel taboo for them beyond the element of sexuality, but the breaking of kayfabe, such as a conversation, would entail something to cause aversion to open conversation.
Yeah, I'm reading and rereading, and I'm gonna answer what I think is being asked, but again, my brain, scrambled egg. Honestly, I think the sort of like parasociality question, like Anna was just saying, like that is something that we are still wrestling with, right? Like it is reaching kind of a saturation point in the conversation. But as Em is also discussing in the Discord, we don't have the sort of the funding required to have the disciplinary rigor required to really have institutional backing and subsequently sort of like a strong theoretical framework as a field, right, of actual play study. As in, we are jury-rigging what we can, and there is a very, very strong base of scholarship. Of course, there are foundational and contemporary texts that we are drawing upon, but we are still trying to understand the specific interaction of parasociality and actual play. And we are also still, in the sort of larger media studies context, trying to understand the intersection of parasociality and media and celebrity, which is with the sort of the Brittany Broskis, the Kareem on the subway takes, that sort of level of trying to get to know celebrities at this level. The kayfabe just gets bigger and bigger, right? The degree of performance that a personality, by which I mean like a media personality, is meant to perform, the stage just keeps extending and keeps leaking across all of these boundaries. There doesn't really seem to be room for a really closed off backstage anymore. So we're actually seeing a resurgence of terms like reclusive and offline and unplugged. And there's backlash to those terms as well, because there is kind of an implicit assumption that if you are an actual play performer, you are my close personal friend. You know, you are this community community-oriented, mutual aid-focused, leftist Californian, right? There are these like really, really strong rhetorical relationships that are sort of increasingly being entangled in terms like actual play performer, in terms like dropout cast member, things like that, right? So I think I wouldn't say that they're taboo. I think these are conversations that we've been having for 2 days, and that we are starting to untangle these roles. And I also think, just to throw another wrench into the mix, as academics, we're also frequently performing, and there are increasingly parasocial connections being formed even in these Discord chats. My close personal friend, Tom Apperley, who is actually my close personal friend, but there's there are layers, right? And I think that we need to understand and really make room for ways to interact with each other that are actually truly backstage, right? And not just like open for critique and open for moralism and open for, well, if I show this to everybody, then what will they think of you? And if you act in this way that's not consistent with your post-production value branding, what will they think of you and what will happen and how hireable will you be? And then it all comes back to the precarity of labor. This is why no one should let me talk after 11 p.m. But
Awesome. Great. I think that all makes sense. It does, strangely. I mean, I was just saying earlier that, as RuPaul, well, RuPaul, everything is drag, right? And I also make the sort of connection to like older forms of parasociality. So like celebrity culture, waiting backstage, waiting outside the stage door for a theater actor to come out to, talk to them and give them flowers. To drag performers, right, where the mediation isn't there, but people still think like they know this performer, or they can touch the performer, or they can hug them and take a picture with them, all these sorts of things. And so, yeah, I don't do parasociality. I'm interested, but it scares me. So the people doing that work, great, amazing. It's also like the people who do the work of the deep recesses of the internet. Yeah, that's much honor and strength to you all. Other questions? Let me just sort of look here, just sort of keeping an eye on things. Okay, force me to go to my notes. How about Anna? I'm really interested, this sort of connects, maybe Anna and Kirsten can speak to the ways that, going back to kind of the question of like the to use Mateo and Apache's word, the pasatopian the possibilities of actual play, and how might we think about that in terms of players navigating race or players navigating gender or sexuality? Is there something more that you wanted to add that you didn't get to in your presentations?
All I can do is to elaborate on the very compressed version of my thoughts that I had in the presentation. Basically, with everything, it comes down to research and nuance, because it's up to debate whether it is inherently wrong or if it's absolutely fine for people to present identities that are not their own. I feel like in TTRPGs, that's kind of the default. You do it, but you do it anyway. And some of the real world
when you're doing it for an audience.
Yeah.
Sorry,
some of the real world influence will creep in no matter what, even if you're consciously trying to avoid it. So best the players can do is just trying to approach this topic thoughtfully, and not presenting easy fixes for difficult institutional or systemic problems, such as like fixing everything with the power of friendship, which is a temptation very often. Yeah, that's as far as I can go.
I mean, there's also a difference between playing, a green half orc at your dinner table and playing a green half orc for the world to see, right?
100%.
And how those negotiations of even fantasy race, dealt with, or in this case, in your talk, don't really get dealt with, which I think is important.
Yeah, that's why I genuinely believe that it's very, very important to consider collaboration in actual play, not just between the players, but also between the players and the audience, because the very presence of the audience significantly influences the final product, what it could have been.
Right. Great.
Yeah, jumping on that. Yeah. I think it's, building on the collaboration, I think that's part of what makes actual play such a great medium, because it is a constant talking, not just we've talked about session zeros a lot, but these conversations need to continuously happen. Every session, every game, if something happens, let's talk about it. What do we want to do with this moving forward? What do we want to leave behind? What do we want to expand upon? And in the Riz stuff, it was really Brennan who was pushing the strong aromanticism of that storyline, as opposed to Murph. Not to say that Murph wasn't involved with that, but it was that collaboration between the two of them. And then with Zolf and Wild, that was a relationship between a player character and a non-player character, where the player character was kind of taking the lead, or the player was taking the lead in what he was comfortable in portraying. And it came down to the fact that he wasn't comfortable portraying a fictional romance with a real person. And again, that was kind of that conversation that kept happening between the two of them, and it then came to the podcast itself, and the listeners could hear their reasoning behind the decisions they were making. And I think it's that actual play has, to an extent, a lot more of breaking the fourth wall behind the scenes than any other medium, where you really do get to see the decisions they're making in real time, but also they explain why they're making those decisions. And the thought process and they walk you through that, and you can see it happening. And I think that's part of what makes actual play so much fun as a viewer, because you feel like you're part of that collaboration. But
awesome.
Yeah, it's still obviously, I don't want to speculate on the players' sexualities. That's not something I think anyone should be doing. So I can't speak for these specific examples, how the players do identify. But I think it is important for players who are both of that sexuality and not of that sexuality to feel like they can contribute to the conversation, and not limit it to specifically only people who are this race or this sexuality can play that character, because I think that does limit discussions.
Awesome. Great. So given that we're winding down, I think it's okay for everyone. We'll just take a deep breath and bring everything to a close. It doesn't look like there are other questions. So another round of applause. Thank you for your wonderful presentations. And let me stop recording.